So the interesting thing is when Ariel asked us to do this presentation, I didn't really think of us as having many internal challenges as we were doing the program. But then on reflection, and she read our report, and on reflection, I kind of realized that we had actually gone through very harmonious challenges, but like challenges all the same, you know? So basically what happened is Volume's a podcasting company. We're based in Johannesburg, and we're a grantee for Membership and News Fund for 2021. That's Andisiwe and our other producer, Amina, in our booth. So the thing is that podcasting companies have struggled to crack the idea of membership, mainly because you don't have a good funnel, which kind of allows people to come into a membership program because they're listening to the podcast in a separate kind of app or on a browser, and you're not kind of meeting them where they are. So that was the first challenge that we knew we had as a podcasting company. So we started with the proposition of membership for one show, but we ended up developing 3 separate membership programs. And that's sort of something that we've realized is a lot of work, but it's kind of a strategy that we sort of stick by. So we've created a membership channel for our investigative podcast, one for What's Crap on WhatsApp, and one for another show that's in Afrikaans called News Met Spies. And we found that people respond to the individual brands of the shows much more than they respond to Volume as a podcasting brand. So the internal challenges was we shifted pretty far from our original. We had this one sort of idea to go towards just one membership program. We've split that into 3, and it all kind of comes down one chute. We had to get ourselves mentally prepared for membership. And we actually realized that this was going to change the whole business. So we're a client servicing company, right? So we produce podcasts for mostly large NGOs, and we get paid to produce the podcast, and then we give it to the NGO, and then that's the transaction. And we've been going a couple of years, and we've kept the lights on, you know, and we've kind of become very preoccupied with what a client wants. And the membership puzzle was an exciting opportunity for us to reorientate around listeners. And that seems strange, right? Because you would always be thinking about listeners if you're a podcasting company. But when you're servicing a client, you kind of get into that mode where if the client's happy, you're happy, and then everyone goes home. So the listeners had become secondary, and we'd lost sort of sight of that in developing projects. So by introducing membership, we changed the types of clients we actually sought out. And that's really kind of come to pass. Even though our membership program is still in its sort of starting phases, the fact that we've reorientated the business to search for clients that we would want to create projects with that would be suitable for our listeners is a huge change. You can imagine that, right? And we're getting this feedback from the newsletters we're producing, from the other content around the membership program that we're producing. We did a lot of audience research. So we're getting this better sense of our listeners. And from there, we're going, okay, we're not going to produce something without a client, but we're going to find a client that would want to produce something for these listeners that we know that we've got. We know we've got this market out there that's excited about certain things that we produce, and we can fund that with a client. And that's a huge change. It's basically reorientated our company around listeners. And even though the membership program is not at this stage kind of funding everything, it's like by seeing everything through the membership program itself and the clients on the other side of it, it completely reorientates the company.
Just to expand on what Paul has pointed out already, in the beginning stages at Volume, when we were grappling with the idea of the membership program, we were already client orientated, and it was a thing of trying to impress the client, but also to encourage them to either produce more episodes for a specific show with the potential to create revenue, right? But as Paul said, there was this whole entire shift that came through viewing it from the perspective of the membership program and realizing that the listener is key for a successful membership program. And so we needed to shift towards producing more listeners, impressing them to get them to eventually to pay, which leads to the next point, which then says listen and not assume. And by this, I mean to listen to what the conversation is around memberships, among the listeners themselves, and not to assume what we want it to be and what we think it is. And so learning that building a membership is a conversation. It's not just limited to listening to the client, but it's a conversation between the shows, the client, the listeners, us at Volume, and of course the different coaches that were involved in the process. And at Volume, we needed to listen and ask ourselves, even as avid podcast listeners, what would we want? You know, listeners are always talking, listeners are always sharing feedback and opinions, which is why a survey was a necessary part or step for us to listen intently and to capitalize on what we learned from our listeners and potential members, and taking that information and then implementing it. And like I said, you know, listening equals feedback and data, and through the survey, we were able to do that. The survey was the best source of real-time feedback. That, together with the data we got from the survey, we were able to diagnose the good, if we're on the right track, and the bad, what we needed to bring back to the drawing table, what we needed to change, or even what we needed to include going forward. But it also allowed us the opportunity to identify opportunities to create a better experience for the membership program itself. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you. So we took, let me just, sorry, this is very slow. I mean, basically what then we were able to do was that we were able to have this, we built time into the schedule basically for creative thinking. And this kind of is historically what the company has always done. When we were first starting out, we started out in community radio projects, and I used to send these long emails to my business partner about like what we're going to do and how we're changing this and how we're going to change that. And I think that became completely disregarded after we found that we were going to move into podcasting, and that we went into an engagement kind of just product orientated phase for the last year or so. But what the membership program allowed us to do was it gave us as an excuse to kind of just think of lots of random creative decisions and brainstorm in a completely new way, which we'd been used to in the past, but we kind of lost sight of. But it actually did it in a much more constructive way, because obviously we had Ben, our coach, and it sort of highlighted the fact that we have to, going forward, think of these brainstorming creative sessions as not something that's going to disrupt the whole business, because I think that's how we come to know them. Like, oh, like any kind of creativity is going to basically short circuit the business, and now we have to pivot to something else, and like we're going to chuck out the baby with the bathwater. But what we realized through this process is we can contain our creativity, we can have these brainstorming sessions, and it won't necessarily throw everything out, but it will kind of keep us able to kind of refresh. And that was something that through introducing membership, we were able to do, like not just through how we orientated the business, but also kind of the products that we were producing. And I think that allowing that creativity into your newsroom in a controlled way, not in a scary way, is really, really useful.
So, you know, getting the listeners to be members and how to make it inclusive and exclusive at the same time. I think this for us was having to think into what goes into the process and what stays out of the process. You know, because we're building a lot of, you know, the membership program around specific shows by clients, we needed to see what the themes will be, what will hook people in, and make sure that every membership or newsletter that we send out goes beyond just having people, you know, or creating listener revenue. And with the newsletters, which is one of the ways that we started it out, even internally, just sending the newsletter formats to all the members or all the staff members at Volume, and getting feedback on what we liked and what we didn't like. But a lot of the creativity came from the selected shows that we used or are building membership around. And thinking around, for example, who wouldn't want a mug for What's Crap on WhatsApp, which is our fact-checking show in partnership with Africa Check, or even having a group session or one-on-one session with our investigative guru, Paul McNally. So these are just some of the things that we had to think around, and the elements that we needed to brainstorm to build different tiers or different elements to what this will look like as a package, and not just a unilateral approach. But also capitalizing on what we do, which is podcasting. And our investigative newsletter does this perfectly. As someone who's working on their first investigative podcast, reading that newsletter is like watching an episode of Forensic Files, right? I'm getting into the process of what various podcasters follows, what goes through their minds, how they approach things. And it's that relatability that draws me in, the curiosity, but also what I walk away from as someone who's approaching or currently busy with an investigative podcast. So it was trying to make sure that it's more than just a membership, trying to create a platform, but also a community as well. And then this goes to the next point, which is design and engagement. And one of the things we wanted to avoid was a long or a traditional approach to things. We wanted to make sure that even with our newsletters, we keep them brief, we keep them short, we keep them informative, but also engaging and perhaps entertaining as well where we can. One of the things, for example, that we added to our What's Crap on WhatsApp newsletter was a segment to allow people to interact with us. We call it Where's the Crap This Week? And it's basically just pictures or a picture of a building or a setting somewhere with the crap emoji, and people need to respond and let us know where this picture was taken. But also understanding that we can't have a unilateral approach because, for example, our Andisiwe space, listeners wouldn't necessarily appreciate that kind of element to that membership.
So we got comfortable with chucking out ideas that didn't work. And also I wanted to add that what the membership program allowed us to do, which I think was part of the internal challenges that we were having and how we resolved them, was that it made us more of a thought leader in this investigative podcasting space, or at least we're striving for that. Because I think we'd always been a jack of all trades, and we'd sort of struggled to where we're going to put our foot forward, right? It's like, what do we want people to think of when they think of volume? And it was fascinating about how going through the membership program and resolving those kind of almost identity issues, we kind of realized that how people saw us when we did the research was that they saw us as an investigative unit. And that's how we wanted to see ourselves as well. So we basically tried to then, through the newsletter and through our rebranding, we kind of pushed ourselves as this kind of investigative podcasting company, even though we do other things as well. And just on the back of that, we've had meetings with people that have read the newsletter, with clients that want to be associated with an investigative unit, an investigative podcasting unit at that. So I guess what I'd like to stress is that your revenue, because when we first, the challenge that we had was when we were first thinking about membership, we were thinking, oh, this is a whole different revenue stream. This is like a different company. And instead it just consumed the whole company, which is much more interesting. And I guess what I'd like to stress is that the revenue that you're going to generate isn't just through people paying a certain amount each month. It's going to be through how people see you, and hopefully that will bring clients and in some cases advertisers to your fold that will kind of want to be associated with you.
Then just to close off my slide, as Paul said at the beginning, we started out, or might have mentioned, we had started out with 5 potential shows that we were exploring building membership around. And at the end of this, we ended up with 2 shows, which was the Andisiwe Space and What's Crap on WhatsApp, and then a theme, which was the investigative podcasts, right? And for various reasons, we needed to shift away from some of the options that we had initially started with, and go with the ones that gave us thriving ground for membership. Andisiwe Space is a ground-up podcast that had an organic growth of listeners during the lockdown period in South Africa, and it had a Facebook-based fellowship. It's an Afrikaans-based podcast, and so it was a completely great moment and opportunity to experiment with, which is a market that we've never tapped into, or listenership that we hadn't really tapped into before. And it was the perfect show to experiment around. What's Crap on WhatsApp, on the other hand, already had the numbers, and it was the perfect starting point to build on that podcast base. It was very ideal. But also experimenting in future with payments over WhatsApp is some of the things that we are looking into, as well as for Neesmith Space. So both of these shows provided opportunities to work with what we know and to explore at the same time, as compared to the other shows that we had started with, which we found out going into the process that it's not going to work. And so that was just part of the learning curve with regards to checking out ideas, that everything that we thought we wanted to do wouldn't necessarily be what we ended up with at the end, and being open and adaptable to that. Also, just lastly, putting a pin on it. So there are certain ideas and certain things that we had thrown out and put on the drawing board in the beginning. And obviously, as things progressed, we needed to either check them out or put them aside, but also to just ensure that, checking something out or an idea out isn't completely discarding it, but it's recognizing that it's not going to be applicable now in this point in time, but it may be useful later or in future. So it's always a good idea to sort of kind of take those ideas and put them in a cocoon or in a box somewhere, to revisit and make sure that you're adaptable to any changes that come with the process, and embrace them. Yeah. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Andisiwe.